In the short period after the incident involving the spy balloon in February of this year, US-China relations have entered a crisis. However, this has not deterred the strong desire for collaboration with China from the US technology sector. Top leaders from major US tech companies have made successive visits to China in recent months, including Apple's CEO Tim Cook, Tesla CEO Elon Musk, and the renowned billionaire Bill Gates. These series of visits underscore China's significance in the US technology industry, despite the escalating competition between the two nations. From this, it is evident that the major US tech players remain deeply addicted to China and unwilling to abandon this market. The importance of China to these tech giants raises questions. What makes China such a top priority for them, despite the current tensions and pressures? Let's explore further in today's World Affairs. The U.S. tech leaders' attention to China demonstrates the country's critical importance to some of America's biggest companies. The big question facing the C-suite is how do they fit into the new Chinese economy, where geopolitics is front and center, said Abhishek Prakash, CEO of the Geopolitical Business, a Toronto-based advisory company. They know the direction things are moving in. The Chinese market is increasingly becoming less and less accessible, and this is why executives are going to China to meet with government officials to gauge how the operating environment will change, he said. While the U.S. tightened sanctions aimed at blocking China from accessing U.S. technology, the biggest American tech companies still heavily rely on China's tech imports and the Chinese market. In fact, despite 5 years of decoupling, this reliance has barely changed and in some cases grown, making the companies vulnerable to politics. In 2018, Washington began the move to decouple from China under then U.S. President Donald Trump, imposing restrictions on exports and investments aimed at limiting China's access to advanced U.S. technology. Washington particularly wanted to prevent the outflow of technologies that can be diverted to military use and to reduce the excessive dependence on supply chains located in China. But 5 years on, an analysis of financial data by Nikkei Asia shows U.S. technology companies still depend crucially on China for a large portion of their sales. Meanwhile, dependence on China as measured by the portion of yearly sales increased or remained almost unchanged since 2018 for many top tech brands such as Apple and Tesla. Even companies in the semiconductor sector, which has been specifically targeted by the US government and recently by China as well, have seen little change in the portion of their revenue generated in China. It is difficult to say whether China depends on U.S. technology more than U.S. technology companies rely on the Chinese market and supply chain. But whether the case, the dependency of each side on the other has not shrunk except in few cases. Apple, the world's most valuable company by market capitalization at $3 trillion, was the global company earning the most sales in China in 2022, close to $70 billion, according to Quick Fact Set. Qualcomm, a major U.S. chip company, depends on China for more than 60% of its sales. Tesla relies on China for over 20% of its sales. According to a company filing, the amount of its total sales that Apple generated in Greater China, which includes mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, decreased only 0.74 of a percentage point to 18.8% in the most recent fiscal year, compared to the fiscal year ending September 2018. Greater China remains Apple's second-largest source of revenue, following the company's home market. Apple's Greater China revenue jumped 43% to $72.2 billion in fiscal 2022 from $51.9 billion in fiscal 2018, after revenue decreased in fiscal 2019 and fiscal 2020 due to China's economic slowdown. Apple has been focusing on developing the Chinese market since around 2014. At the company's earnings call in October 2015, the year when net sales from Greater China surpassed those from Europe, Cook said he was very bullish on the Chinese market and the company would be investing in China for the decades ahead, sharing his view that China will be Apple's top market in the world. As for Tesla, its sales in China have leaped in large part due to China's rapid adoption of electric vehicle technology. In 2022, it earned 22% of its total sales in China, up from 8% in 2018. Qualcomm, which is highly dependent on China, in the year through last September, made 63.6% of its sales in mainland China and Hong Kong. The ratio was 67% in fiscal 2018, according to company filings. 8 of the companies most dependent on China for sales were in the semiconductor sector, the area where the conflict between the US and China has been most severe. In October, for example, Washington banned US companies from supplying some categories of semiconductors, chip-making equipment, and updates for parts sales to Chinese chip companies. It also prohibited American citizens from working with Chinese semiconductor companies. Another US-based chip equipment company, Lam Research, expects annual sales in 2023 to fall by $2 billion to $2.5 billion due to US restrictions. Lam Research China revenue was down 34% to $839 million year-on-year for the quarter that ended March 26. The sharp decline in China business was largely attributed to the U.S. government sales restrictions for certain Chinese domestic customers, said Douglas Bettinger, the company's chief financial officer. Notwithstanding the ramp-up in political pressure, for Qualcomm, Lam Research, and 4 other U.S. companies in the semiconductor industry, China was the largest source of revenue last year, surpassing the major markets of Europe, the United States, and Japan. These companies are emblematic of how the current U.S. sanctions are causing damage to crucial industries. U.S. tech companies' high exposure to China is just a statement of China's share of global GDP and China's share of the global population, said David Wong, head of APAC Technology Research, Nomura. And until fairly recently, there was no particular reason to think that there was particularly high risk in developing the Chinese market. Overall bilateral trade between the US and China, the world's 2 largest economies, reached a record $690 billion last year, with US exports to China increasing by 28% between 2018 and 2022. US imports from China in 2022 totaled $536.3 billion. China has grown to be an indispensable part of the global economy, said Fu Fangjian, an associate professor of finance at Lee Kong Chian School of Business, Singapore Management University. He added that China is now also a single market, not much less than the domestic US market for these high-tech companies. While the US government tried to block Chinese access to high technology, the high-tech firms in the US can't live without the Chinese market. Some experts warn that high dependency on China for revenue could prove to be a source of vulnerability for US tech companies. The biggest risk for these US tech companies is outright bans and losing the ability to sell or manufacture in China, Prakash of the Geopolitical Business Advisory said. The technology industry today is struggling with a weak economic environment and declining market demand. In such circumstances, the US technology sector could be even more susceptible to the impact of restrictions. For companies like Apple, a major smartphone and personal computer vendor, Tesla, an electric car manufacturer, and semiconductor producers supplying chips to electronic device manufacturers in China, the outcomes of the US-China trade confrontation and the potential for further escalation can have significant consequences. To mitigate geopolitical risks, some companies in the US tech industry have begun to reorganize their operations in China in an effort to contain any potential damage from sanctions. In early June, leading U.S. venture capital firm Sequoia Capital announced it had decided to separate its China division. Sequoia said the three heads of its U.S. and Europe, China, India, and Southeast Asia businesses will be split up and independently operated by March 2024. In May, LinkedIn, a social media platform owned by Microsoft focusing on business networking, announced it would shut down its jobs apps in China and cut more than 700 positions. LinkedIn cited shifts in customer behavior and slower revenue growth as reasons behind the decision. However, analysts do not see the US-China technology confrontation ending anytime soon. Akira Minamigawa, Senior Consulting Director at UK-based research company Omdia, predicts that the US will only quit once China's technological competitiveness decreases. Just like the trade war with Japan, it won't stop unless the US sees a clear victory, he said. There's no easy answer for companies dealing with the US-China rivalry, Prakash of the Geopolitical Business Advisory said. These firms are used to accessing the whole world with no limits. The C-suite has to accept that a new status quo is forming.